The moment that changed everything did not begin with shouting or anger, but with laughter, the kind that fills a room quickly and leaves no space for dignity, because once people start laughing at you together, they stop seeing you as a person and start seeing you as a moment. I was standing in the center of a family gathering, surrounded by familiar faces, holiday decorations, and the soft noise of people who believed they were safe among their own, when my niece turned toward me with a smile that was too confident to be kind and said something about me that made the room erupt. The laughter came fast and loud, bouncing off the walls, feeding on itself, and growing stronger with every second I remained silent, because nothing fuels cruelty more than an audience that feels permitted to enjoy it. What stayed with me was not the insult itself, but the sound of people I had loved for years finding amusement in my discomfort, as if my place in the family had quietly shifted from respected relative to acceptable target. I am Elena, and I had spent most of my life believing that being calm, private, and self-contained would protect me from being humiliated publicly, never realizing that those very traits could one day be mistaken for weakness. The gathering took place in a comfortable American home filled with seasonal warmth, the kind of environment that usually promises safety, which made the humiliation feel sharper because it arrived where I least expected harm. My niece Sabrina had always enjoyed attention, especially the kind that comes from controlling a room, and she had learned early that laughter could be used like a weapon if delivered confidently enough. Her mother, my sister Diane, stood nearby that day, smiling faintly, saying nothing, offering no correction. And in that silence I saw something unsettling, because silence from a parent often feels like approval to a child who already believes she can do no wrong. My brother-in-law Victor was there as well, observing without reaction, his presence steady and neutral, the kind of neutrality that protects comfort rather than fairness. In that moment, surrounded by people who chose entertainment over empathy, I understood that this was not a misunderstanding or a careless joke, but a performance, one designed to place me beneath her socially and confirm that the room would allow it. The laughter eventually faded, replaced by movement, conversation, and food, as if nothing significant had happened, while something irreversible settled quietly inside me. No one checked on me. No one acknowledged the moment. No one questioned whether it had crossed a line. Instead, I was expected to absorb it gracefully, because families often mistake endurance for acceptance and composure for consent. As the evening continued, I watched Sabrina move through the room with renewed confidence, her posture lighter, her voice louder, because humiliation rewarded publicly tends to reinforce itself. I realized then that what had happened was not just about me, but about how the family hierarchy was being tested and reshaped in real time, with laughter acting as the deciding vote. I did not defend myself, not because I could not, but because defense would have shifted the focus away from her behavior and toward my reaction, allowing everyone to excuse the cruelty as sensitivity. Instead, I observed, because observation preserves truth while reaction often dilutes it. As memories surfaced, I saw earlier moments differently. Small comments dismissed as jokes, subtle disrespect explained away as personality, and patterns that only made sense once the laughter became loud enough to expose them. Sabrina had been testing boundaries for years, learning how far she could go without consequences, while Diane protected her with excuses and Victor protected himself with distance. That evening simply confirmed what had been quietly building. that my role in the family had become conditional, valued only as long as I remained useful, quiet, and unchallenging. What hurt most was not the mockery, but the realization that the family I trusted had already rehearsed my silence, already decided I would not disrupt the comfort of the room. As I sat there, smiling faintly when expected, I felt something settle into place. Not rage, but clarity, because clarity arrives when denial finally exhausts itself. I understood that speaking up in that moment would have changed nothing, because people who laugh together rarely listen afterward. Instead, I allowed the moment to exist fully, to be remembered exactly as it happened, because moments witnessed by many tend to return later with weight. When patterns emerge, I began to sense that this humiliation was not an ending but a beginning, the first visible fracture in a structure that had been quietly unstable for years. The evening ended the way it began, warmly and comfortably for everyone else, while I left carrying an awareness that could not be set down. I did not cry that night. I did not confront anyone. I did not demand an apology. I simply recognized that something fundamental had changed. And once family laughter teaches you where you stand, the only question left is whether you accept that place or allow time to expose who truly belongs where. And as I drove home alone, replaying the sound of that laughter in my mind, I realized that what they thought was a harmless moment had quietly begun a process none of them were prepared for. Because families can laugh you out of dignity once, but when patterns reveal themselves, families also know how to remove what threatens their image entirely. They just did not yet know who that would be. What followed that evening was not an apology or an uncomfortable conversation, but something far more revealing, which was the complete absence of accountability. Because when cruelty is rewarded with laughter, it rarely retreats. It only waits for a larger stage. In the days after the gathering, no one mentioned what had happened, not Diane, not Victor, and certainly not Sabrina. As if the moment had dissolved into harmless humor the second the room moved on, leaving me alone with its weight. That silence confirms something important, because when people are embarrassed by their behavior, they rush to clarify or justify it. But when they feel entitled to it, they pretend nothing happened at all. Sabrina's behavior toward me changed. Subtly at first, not softer, but bolder. As though the laughter had validated something she had long believed, that she could say anything about me publicly and face no resistance. She spoke more freely around me, with less filtering, less caution, and an unmistakable confidence that the family would continue to protect her comfort over my dignity. Diane mirrored this shift in quieter ways, brushing past moments of tension with forced cheerfulness, avoiding eye contact whenever the subject drifted close to respect or boundaries. Because avoidance is easier than correction when correction threatens control, Victor maintained his familiar neutrality, present but disengaged, the kind of presence that allows patterns to continue unchecked. Because no one feels directly opposed, I did not confront anyone during this time because confrontation would have given them an opportunity to reframe the situation as mutual misunderstanding rather than repeated disrespect. Instead, I began watching more closely, not just how Sabrina treated me, but how she treated others when she believed humor excused cruelty. What became clear was that I was not the only target, just the safest one. Because once someone learns that laughter protects them, they begin to test how far that protection extends. Sabrina's remarks toward other family members grew sharper, though still disguised as jokes, and each time, the room reacted with discomfort rather than laughter. revealing the thin line she was starting to cross. I noticed the shift in body language, the forced smiles, the awkward pauses, the way people avoided responding directly because discomfort is often the first sign that tolerance is wearing thin. Diane continued to shield her, stepping in subtly whenever reactions cooled, reframing comments as humor, youth, or personality, but the effort began to show strain. What Diane did not realize was that protection works only when behavior remains isolated. But once a pattern forms publicly, defense becomes harder to sustain. I allow this pattern to unfold naturally, not influencing it, not highlighting it, simply existing within it, because patterns expose themselves best when uninterrupted. As gatherings continued, Sabrina grew increasingly performative, leaning into sarcasm, exaggeration, and commentary designed to draw attention. Because attention had become her currency, each remark landed slightly harder than the last, and each reaction from the room grew quieter. Because amusement fades quickly when repetition reveals intent, I felt the atmosphere changing, not dramatically, but perceptibly, as if the family had begun reassessing the role they had assigned her without consciously admitting it. What struck me most was how quickly power dynamics shift when people sense risk, because cruelty is entertaining only until it threatens collective image. At one gathering, I noticed how Sabrina's comment about someone else fell into silence rather than laughter, and that silence echoed louder than any reaction before it. For the first time, Diane looked uncomfortable rather than confident, scanning faces instead of smiling automatically. Because the room was no longer cooperating, Victor's neutrality began to falter as well, not through words but through distance, the kind that signals awareness without intervention. I realized then that the family was not reacting to me anymore, but to the pattern Sabrina was building, a pattern that no longer felt contained or harmless. Through all of this, I remained composed, not performing humility or forgiveness, but maintaining consistency, because consistency makes contrast visible. The contrast between my restraint and her escalation began to speak for itself without explanation or defense. At the same time, the presence of Harris, in broader family contexts, introduced a shift I could not have manufactured myself, because external perception carries weight that internal relationships often lack. Harris observed without reacting, without laughing, without excusing. And that lack of response altered the atmosphere subtly but unmistakably. Sabrina noticed it too, though she did not understand it yet, because she began increasing her performance rather than moderating it, mistaking attention for approval. That escalation marked a turning point, because when someone doubles down on behavior that is losing its audience, they reveal desperation rather than confidence. By then, the family dynamic had begun to strain under the weight of repeated discomfort, and conversations grew shorter, gatherings felt heavier, and laughter became selective. I understood that we were approaching a moment where the family will be forced to choose between protecting an individual's behavior and protecting its own sense of identity. That choice rarely happens suddenly, but it always announces itself through tension, silence, and subtle withdrawal. As I watched Sabrina continue, unaware that the room was slowly closing around her rather than opening, I felt a quiet certainty settle in, because she had mistaken tolerance for loyalty and loyalty for permanence. She did not yet realize that the laughter she relied on had already begun to fade, replaced by something far more dangerous to her position, which was collective discomfort. And as that discomfort deepened, I knew that the next stage would no longer be about jokes or gatherings, but about consequences that no One could laugh away. By the time the shift became undeniable, no one could point to a single moment where everything broke, because family exile rarely happens through confrontation. It happens through accumulation, when discomfort outweighs denial and silence replaces laughter permanently. The gatherings continued, but they felt different now, quieter, heavier, as if everyone had become more aware of what could be said safely and what could not, because once a family senses internal risk, self-preservation slowly overrides habit. Sabrina did not notice the change at first because she was still performing for a reaction that no longer existed, mistaking attention for approval even as the room withdrew from her emotionally. Her remarks continued, sharp and self-assured, but they began landing in empty space, greeted by glances instead of laughter, pauses instead of encouragement, and subtle shifts in posture that signaled unease rather than amusement. What made this stage irreversible was not anything I said or did, but the growing awareness among the family that her behavior was no longer isolated to one person or one moment, but had become a defining trait they could no longer excuse without consequence. Diane's defenses weakened visibly, not because she suddenly understood the harm, but because protecting Sabrina now required explaining behavior that others had begun to question. Openly in private conversations, Victor's neutrality finally collapsed under the weight of repetition, because silence stops being safe once patterns threaten the collective image, and his withdrawal was no longer invisible. The presence of Harris accelerated everything, not through intervention, but through observation, because external eyes strip humor of its protection and force behavior to stand on its own merit. Sabrina sensed the change eventually, though she misread it entirely, interpreting the lack of response as a challenge rather than a warning, which led her to escalate one final time. At a larger family event, surrounded by relatives and acquaintances whose opinions mattered beyond comfort, Sabrina crossed the line so clearly that no one could pretend it was accidental. The room did not react with laughter. It did not react with shock. It reacted with stillness. That stillness carried more weight than any argument ever could, because it signaled collective refusal, not of me, but of her behavior. Diane looked around, searching for support that did not appear, realizing too late that protection without agreement collapses instantly. Victor stepped away physically, creating distance so visible it required no explanation, because alignment is often revealed by where people choose to stand. I did nothing in that moment except remain present, composed and unchanged, because contrast was now complete and undeniable. The event ended awkwardly. Conversations shortened, exits came early, and what remained was an unspoken understanding that something had fractured beyond repair. In the days that followed, the fracture became formalized, not through announcements, but through exclusion, because families removed threats quietly when confrontation risks embarrassment. Sabrina stopped receiving invitations. Her presence became conditional. Her access narrowed. Diane's influence diminished, alongside her daughter's, because enabling behavior carries its own cost once the group withdraws consent. Victor adjusted quickly, prioritizing stability over defense, because survival instincts often override loyalty when reputation is at stake. What stunned Sabrina was not the exclusion itself, but the speed at which it happened, because she had mistaken tolerance for loyalty and laughter for protection. Family events continued without her, not as punishment, but as preservation, because once someone becomes a liability, distance feels like relief rather than cruelty. No dramatic confrontation occurred. No emotional speeches were made. No forgiveness was offered. She was simply no longer included. I observed this transformation with calm clarity, not satisfaction, but closure, because the family had corrected itself in the only way it knew how. By removing what threatened its stability, what returned to me slowly was not applause or validation, but respect, inclusion, and silence where cruelty once thrived. The laughter that once isolated me never returned, replaced by caution and awareness. Because families remember moments that reveal too much. Sabrina existed on the outside now. Watching from a distance, she had created herself, learning too late that public cruelty eventually demands public accountability. Diane lived with the quiet consequences of her protection, and Victor lived with the knowledge that neutrality has limits when patterns become undeniable. As for me, I reclaimed my place without confrontation, without defense, and without compromise. Because dignity does not need to be argued for when truth reveals itself repeatedly. I learned that families do not always exile through anger, but through withdrawal. And that being laughed at once does not define you nearly as much as who the family chooses to laugh with afterward. What began as mockery ended as separation, not because I demanded it, but because behavior that threatens a group's image eventually isolates itself. And if you're standing where I once stood, hearing laughter rise at your expense, would you fight back immediately? Or would you allow time to reveal who truly belongs and who does not? When cruelty is repeated publicly, families eventually protect themselves by removing its source. Because laughter fades, but patterns leave scars.